When you're first clued in to the JQ, one of the first red pills is just how many prominent communists were Jewish. Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, those communists executed for treason in the US, were Jewish. If you remember the Hollywood blacklist, which was when people in Hollywood, specifically Hollywood writers, refused to answer questions in Congress about their communist involvement and so were blacklisted by Hollywood, 6 of those 10 people were Jewish. Moving to the Soviet Union, in the first Politburo, Lenin, Trotsky, Zinoviev, Kamenev, Stalin, Sokolnikov, and Bubnov, 5 out of those 7 members were Jewish. The big name in German communism was Rosa Luxemburg, and she was Jewish too. Talking about the figureheads is interesting and easy to prove, but it also doesn't speak to the larger character of the movement. So let's talk about that. In the US, quote, Jews played a very prominent role in the Communist Party of the United States. For instance, from 1921 to 1961, Jews were about 33% of the Central Committee members and above 40% of the overall membership. In the 1930s, Jews, quote, constituted a substantial majority of known members of the Soviet underground in the US, and almost half of the individuals prosecuted under the Smith Act of 1947. In the US, the leadership of the Communist Party was basically a Jewish organization. Here's a quote from David Horowitz. What my parents had done in joining the Communist Party and moving to Sunnyside was to return to the ghetto. There was the same shared private language, the same hermetically sealed universe, the same dual posturing revealing one face to the outer world and another to the tribe. More importantly, there was the same conviction of being marked for persecution and specially ordained, the sense of moral superiority toward the stronger and more numerous Goyim outside. Here's a Gentile communist talking about his experience at a communist-sponsored youth conference in Wisconsin. Quote, it became increasingly apparent to most participants that virtually all of the speakers were Jewish New Yorkers. Speakers with thick New York accents would identify themselves as the delegate from the Lower East Side or the comrade from Brownsville. Again, this was a national U.S. event held in Wisconsin. The overrepresentation was so crazy, it's sometimes funny. For instance, quote, Hanukkah services were held and the Israeli national anthem were sung during an important sit-in at Berkeley. Moving to the Soviet Union, it wasn't just the Communist Politburo. Quote, individual Jews played an important and sometimes decisive part in the leadership of the 3 main socialist parties, including the Bolsheviks. In Hungary, the communist government was, quote, completely dominated by Jews. 95% of the leading figures of Bela Kun's government were Jews. In Poland, the entire society was basically split along Jew-Gentile lines when it came to the Soviet government. Quote, the general opposition between the Jewish-dominated Polish communist government supported by the Soviets and the nationalist anti-Semitic underground helped forge the allegiance of the great majority of the Jewish population to the communist government, while the great majority of non-Jewish Poles favored the anti-Soviet parties. There were so many Jews, in fact, that you saw cases where Jews specifically recruited Gentiles to make the movement look less Jewish. In the US, quote, efforts were made to recruit Gentiles as window dressing to conceal the extent of Jewish dominance. In Poland, quote, apart from members of the generation whose political loyalties could be counted on and who formed the leadership core of the group, Jews were often discouraged from joining the movement out of fear that the movement would appear too Jewish. However, Jews who could physically pass as Poles were allowed to join and were encouraged to state that they were ethnic Poles and to change their names to Polish-sounding names. So it's pretty clear that these different communist movements all over the world were overwhelmingly led by Jews and staffed by Jews. Considering communism is anti-establishment, anti-tradition, anti-religion, and generally anti-nationalist, you would think that these Jews would give up their Judaism. Largely, they didn't. Generally, they got special treatment and privileges by virtue of being the ruling class. In the Soviet Union, they couldn't legally practice religious Judaism, but at the same time, even though the official ideology viewed nationalism and ethnic separatism as reactionary and thus bad, the Soviet government created a Jewish section of the Communist Party, Yiddish became the recognized language of the Jewish nationality, and state-sponsored Yiddish schools were set up. In Poland, quote, Jewish activists had an ethno-political vision in which Jewish secular culture would continue in Poland with the cooperation and approval of the government. The result was that, quote, while the government campaigned actively against the political and cultural power of the Catholic Church, collective Jewish life flourished in the post-war period. Yiddish and Hebrew language schools and publications were established, as well as a great variety of cultural and social welfare organizations for Jews. So in other words, they suppressed the Catholic Church, they demonized nationalism, and then they had as much religion and nationalism as they wanted in Poland because they were the ruling class. Oftentimes, you'd see anti-nationalist, overwhelmingly Jewish, communist organizations in conflict with nationalistic, ethnic, leftist organizations. In Germany, quote, the conflict between Luxembourg's reactionary left and the social democratic reformists in Germany had overtones of German Jewish ethnic conflict, given the large percentage and high visibility of Jews among the former. In the Soviet Union, quote, the conflict in the 1920s between Stalin and the left opposition, led by Trotsky, Grigory Zinoviev, Lev Kamenev, and Grigory Solkonikov, all of whom were ethnic Jews, had strong overtones of a Jewish-Gentile group conflict. In Poland, the KPP was sometimes called the Jew Commune, and was viewed by the great majority of Poles as foreign and wanting to serve Moscow instead of Poland. And I think they were right to think that. The KPP supported the Soviet Union in the Polish-Soviet War of 1919 to 1920, and in the Soviet invasion of 1939. So in other words, a supposedly Polish movement literally supported a foreign government in a war against Poland, and that group was predominantly Jewish. And then people are surprised when they find out that Polish people are anti-Semitic. I would probably be anti-Semitic too in their position. So taking a step back, imagine you're Jewish. You have more in common linguistically, ethnically, and religiously with small communities around the globe in different countries than you do with any individual country. What you would normally call nationalism, putting your kinsmen above everyone else, would be something closer to globalism for Jews. I think that's why Jewish communism always has this globalist focus. The other thing that's important to remember about how many of these communist movements were overwhelmingly Jewish is that Jews were second-class citizens in many of these countries before the communist revolutions. A revolution promised equal or preferred status. Quote, during the 1930s, the Polish government developed policies in which Jews were excluded from public sector employment, quotas were placed on Jewish representation in universities and the professions, and government-organized boycotts of Jewish businesses and artisans were staged. In the Soviet Union, Jewish literary life flourished under the Soviets, and, quote, the thrust of their prose, poetry, and drama boiled down to one idea: the limitations on their rights under Tsarism and the flowering of once oppressed Jews under the sun of the Lenin-Stalin Constitution. In the US, quote, for many Jewish new leftists, the revolution promised to avenge the sufferings and to right the wrongs which have for so long been inflicted on Jews with the permission or encouragement, or even at the command, of the authorities in pre-revolutionary societies. Communism is generally portrayed as a class war, where the proletariat are trying to topple the bourgeoisie and take control for themselves. When you learn stuff like this, communism starts to look more like a racial war, where Jews who are treated as second-class citizens are trying to get control of the government for themselves. It happened in Poland, Hungary, and it would have happened in the Soviet Union if Stalin hadn't purged all the Jews. And it's probably what would have happened around the world and in the United States if communist revolutions had happened there. Really makes you think. To close out the video, one of our first subscribers ever, Dumbleton, mentioned that he liked that we did some fact-checking in the first video. So for this video, I decided to look a little bit more deeply at a book that Dr. MacDonald cites a lot when he's writing about Poland, The Generation, The Rise and Fall of the Jewish Communists of Poland, by Jaf Schatz. Schatz was the director of the Institute for Jewish Culture at Lund University, which is a fairly prestigious university in Sweden. I decided to focus on one particular quote from The Culture of Critique. Jewish activists had an ethno-political vision in which Jewish secular culture would continue in Poland with the cooperation and approval of the government. I think that's kind of a central quote because it's one of the many claims that's made in the book, basically, that Jews are trying to do this mostly to serve their own interests. They want to keep Jewish culture continuing. Page number is cited 230. Thankfully, this entire book appears to be on Google Books, so we can actually look at that page and the surrounding pages. So just for context, when he's talking about activists here, he's talking specifically about politically radical Jewish communists that basically have control of Poland at this point. Beginning in 1949 to 50, the activists became the undisputed leaders of all those involved in Jewish political, social, and economic institutions in Poland. As such, they administered the official Jewish sector and formulated its ideology. Within the generation, the ethnic content of their vision formed one of the poles in the most important division that split its members, dividing them into Jewish Jews and assimilationists. The activists were guided by an ambition to shape Jewish collective post-war life according to the content of their ethno-political vision. In this vision, Jewish secular culture would bloom under socialist conditions. And it goes on to talk about all of these Hebrew schools and Yiddish schools and stuff like that that furthered the Jewish life under this time. And that seems to roughly fit what Kevin MacDonald was talking about. The main problem I have with this, though, is that it talked specifically about assimilationists. It talked about Jewish Jews as opposed to assimilationists. And the presence of assimilationists is kind of absent from Dr. MacDonald's coverage of this work and generally these different leftist movements in these different countries. And I don't want to go into too much detail because the video got really long, but I read about another 30 or 40 pages of this book that he's citing, and it seems to be making the case that a Jewish identity sort of disappeared in the next decade or so as people stopped speaking Yiddish, stopped speaking Hebrew, these schools shut down, etc., etc. I want to actually look into this a little bit more. I'm going to read this book, I'm going to make a video on it, I'm going to learn about it, and that way I can provide an informed opinion to you guys. So that's not really the way I wanted to end this, but I think it is important to stay intellectually honest, and I'll still make a video on the next chapter, which is on Freud and psychoanalysis, very soon. So I'll see you guys then.